welcome to Banks Western Canon. In today's episode, we are going to be continuing our discussion of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, before we dive into the Epic of Gilgamesh, I'd like to talk a little bit about current events and how the epic relates to them. One of the things that I enjoy the most about reading canonical literature, and especially ancient canonical literature, is it gives us the ability to step back from our day to day and think about the human condition from a much broader lens. When you read a story like the Epic of Gilgamesh, you realize that human beings really haven't changed all that much in 5,000 years. An example of how the human condition or situation has not really changed much since the advent of writing is form of government. Going back to the time of Gilgamesh, who historians believe probably was a real king, a real person who was eventually mythologized and deified. But going back to his historical precedent, we learn that in ancient Mesopotamia, going all the way back to Uruk, which was one of the first city-states that Gilgamesh and his father and grandfather founded, in fact, a single leader ruled the individual city-states in Uruk and the surrounding competing city-states. So that's a precedent that was established in ancient times. Now that individual leader, think of him, back then it was most likely him, but think of him as an executive. He ruled the city-state, and depending on the size and the vastness of the area of that city-state, he may have had an extended retinue that helped him keep control of the land. But at the end of the day, ultimately, the final decisions and the final rule came down to a single person. It wasn't only in ancient Mesopotamia that we see this occurring. In ancient Egypt, the same precedent developed pretty much concurrently at the same time. So the precedent of a single ruler, but that precedent was established not only in ancient Mesopotamia, but also in ancient Egypt, which, by the way, the two aren't that far apart from each other, so they influenced one another through trading routes. Now, despite our experiments with different forms of government since ancient times, we still see today the majority of countries have a single executive leader. So that idea of having a single person who ultimately authority and the buck stops with, that has continued to present day. In fact, only 2% of countries recognized by the United Nations today, only 2% are ruled by committee. The rest, 98% of countries, are ruled ultimately by a single executive leader. Now, granted, that single executive leader today has different titles depending on the cultural and historical traditions of a country. We might call the leader a king, a president, a chancellor, an emperor. The titles may be different. But at the end, whether the leader is a figurehead, a leader in name only, or whether he is a dictator, full control over everything, there is this concept that I would argue is now innate to humanity to have a single executive style leader of a country. An additional thing that I really appreciate about reading canonical literature, and again, especially ancient canonical literature, is that it gives you the ability to see things from a different perspective. So by way of example, I'm an American educated in the American educational system, and I have literally been told my entire life that kingship is bad. And in fact, if you read the popular press right now, you'll see the slogan that Americans have been rejecting kings since 1776. Let's take a step back and think about what it means when we say that we are rejecting kingship. For example, let's compare America to Great Britain today, in the present day. The President of the United States, regardless of who is in office, the President of the United States today has far more power and far more control than the King of Great Britain. When we say that we're rejecting kings since 1776, is that really what we're rejecting? Or are we really rejecting tyranny? And I would argue that that is what we're really rejecting, regardless of the title of our leader. One could also argue that the ideals of kingship, which were established in ancient times, are actually the ideals of great leadership. And it doesn't matter what the title is of the leader, whether he's a king, a president, a chancellor, an emperor, that a great leader spans across, the ideals of that great leader span across titles and across countries and across cultural traditions. Now, there are ideals about great leadership. The idea of a leader being a guide to his or her people. The idea of the leader protecting his or her people or protecting the norms of society. And the idea of a leader being just and fair. Those are ancient ideals wrapped up in ancient times in kingship that we shouldn't be so quick to reject. Tyranny is the real problem. And when you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you learn that tyranny, just like kingship, has been around for a long time. In fact, the threat of tyranny is what drives the plot of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh isn't all about tyranny. There's other aspects to the story that we'll get into. But the impetus, the thing that gets the plot going, the device that's used, is the threat of tyranny on the part of Gilgamesh. At the start of the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh is immature, he's violent, he's entitled, and of course he's entitled, he's a king, that's his title, but he's also entitled in a negative way, in a psychological way. He feels that he deserves things that he certainly hasn't earned. He is not behaving the way the ancients felt a king should behave. One of the scholars that I quote the most when it comes to ancient Mesopotamia is a scholar by the name of Andrew George. Andrew George is well known for creating probably the most comprehensive academic translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He's an Assyriologist. And not only did he create the most academic translation, he's also created the most well-known and popular translation for the average reader. Andrew George is a phenomenal writer, and he has a terrific introduction to the Epic of Gilgamesh in his translation for Penguin Classics. So I highly recommend, if you get the opportunity, pick that up. It's really good because it sets the context and sets the stage to help the reader understand what is this story all about. Now, one of the things that Andrew George said about kingship in ancient Mesopotamia is as follows. In Babylonian ideology, as throughout the ancient Near East, the king should be to his people as a shepherd to his sheep, guiding them, protecting them, and ruling them with a just and equitable hand. Far from that, Gilgamesh is a cruel tyrant whose brutality calls for the complaint of his people. Those ancient ideals that the ancient Babylonians and before them the ancient Sumerians had are still in existence today, whether it's a king or any other type of individual leader. So in ancient times, when you have a king who is acting completely egregiously, what were people to do? This wasn't a democracy, remember. This was more like a dictatorship. What were people supposed to do when they were faced with a king like this? Now, Uruk had a collection or group of people called the city elders. And in theory, those elders advised Gilgamesh. But because Gilgamesh was so immature and he was behaving like a tyrant, he didn't care what the elders thought. He didn't care what their opinion was. He was going to do what he was going to do. The elders go to the gods and plead for their help. What was it that Gilgamesh was doing that was so bad? Well, not only was he attacking men in the city, he was walking around acting like a thug and beating people up and killing people. Even worse, and potentially more offensive to the gods and to society, he was accosting women sexually. So Gilgamesh believed that he had the right to take the virginity of a bride on her wedding night and have sex with her before the bridegroom ever was intimate with his wife. This was extremely offensive to society, and it is probably the final straw that caused the elders to seek out the help from the gods, because there was nothing they could do to stop him from behaving this way. The gods hear the plea of the elders and they decide to comply. Now, one might say, why didn't people just band together and overthrow Gilgamesh? Why didn't the leaders attempt to pull together an army and overthrow him? But back then, kingship was really the only form of rule in a civilized city-state. So there was a real desire on the part of society to protect not only the title of kingship, but to protect the person who was acting as king. Yes, they could have ousted Gilgamesh, but that was seen as actually a more destabilizing act than trying to somehow convince Gilgamesh through an act of the gods to pull himself together and start acting more maturely. So the gods comply with the request of the elders, and they ask the goddess Oruru to create a foil for Gilgamesh. She, as the mother goddess, complies with the request of the gods. Out of earth clay and divine spittle, the double, the stormy-hearted other, Enkidu. That couplet by David Ferry is brilliant. David Ferry's version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I have been commenting on, is what's called a rendering rather than a direct translation. In both Andrew George's word-for-word translation, as well as Stephanie Dalley's translation, there's no mention of the word spittle in the translation of the standard version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Oruru washes her hands with water before she creates Enkidu, but she doesn't spit. But just because that is not in the word-for-word translations, I think what Ferry is doing here is picking up on an ancient mythological tradition as it relates to Mesopotamia. Here's a quote by George that will explain further. The divine element in mankind's creation explains why, an obvious distinction from the animals, the human race has self-consciousness and reason. Now, what Andrew George is getting at here is that ancient Mesopotamians believed in their mythology that human beings were created from a combination of divine material and earthly material. So what David Ferry does in his rendering is he takes a very complex idea and he summarizes it in 4 words: earth, clay, divine, and spittle. Ultimately, what Enkidu represents here is the divine creation of human beings. When Oruru creates Enkidu, he's created as a full-grown person. He's created from clay and her spittle, and he is naked, and he's not even aware of that. He doesn't care. He's hairy, he's incredibly strong, and he's wild. Now, this nakedness and unawareness has a purpose. According to Andrew George, the innately rebellious and unruly nature of man encapsulated in this myth of his creation also informs one tradition about early human history. That the first men roamed free and lawless and were not subject to kings helped to give rise to a myth that kings were created as distinct beings, significantly different from other mortals in appearance, capabilities, and duties. So, while human beings are a combination of divine and earthly stuff, and we can see that represented in Enkidu, kings are an even further step. They are a distinct, separate type of human being created specifically to perform certain duties in society. They have certain responsibilities above and beyond what the average person has. This obviously shouldn't be a surprise to us. All leaders have this. But in early human history, that wasn't necessarily something that was the case. That evolved over time. And what Gilgamesh represents is what happens when you have a leader with whom those things go wrong. The leader isn't behaving in the way that he should behave. And what happens to society? Society becomes very unstable at that time. While Enkidu is running free and living the great natural off-grid life, Gilgamesh is in his city beating up men and sexually accosting women. And yet Gilgamesh is supposed to be the leader, the admirable person, while Enkidu is just this wild creature. The literary critic Northrop Frye discusses what the purpose of the epic format of literature is. The purpose of the literary epic ultimately is to lay down the law of the gods. The epic is an educational tool. In this case, it's a negative demonstration. It's an educational tool about how not to behave as a king, and in fact, how not to behave as a human being. Now, we have to remember, I've been speaking in this episode as if the gods are real. And really what we're talking about here is mythology. I've been speaking as if Enkidu and Gilgamesh are real people. Now, while we think Gilgamesh may have been a real person, really they are, in this example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they're fictional characters. So it's not Gilgamesh and Enkidu who have lessons to learn. It's us, the reader. We have the lessons to learn from this story about how not to behave. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu are just the examples, and any learning that they do as fictional characters is really the purpose that it serves is for us to learn from that learning. Reading a work of ancient literature that's at least 5,000 years old, if not older, if we consider the oral tradition before history, before writing, reminds us that ancient wisdom still applies today. The beliefs of the ancients that we have been discussing in today's episode that have carried forward are the beliefs in leadership ideals, the belief in human specialness, and the idea that the leader has a level of responsibility above and beyond what the average human has. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please like and subscribe. I'd also love to hear your comments below. Can you think of other ideals that a leader has that might have been established in ancient times and may apply to today? Or vice versa, can you think of ancient leadership ideals or ancient mythology that has carried forward today, but that you think no longer serves us, and that maybe we should think about things in a different way? I would love to hear your thoughts, so please comment below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.